Well, thanks to you both. Good evening and welcome to the show, which will start with the second part of our investigation into the case of Derek Bromley, who spent 28 years in jail for murder. Now, the Attorney General John Rau is poised to change the law to allow possible wrongful convictions back before the court. And the serious questions we're raising tonight over the credibility of the evidence, witnesses and the forensics in the trial of Derek Bromley may well make this one of the first cases to be reviewed. Here's Graham Archer.
You're an innocent man.
Yep.
Derek Bromley's an innocent man.
Yep.
And this has been a real injustice.
Yes.
His heart is to see justice done for himself, not only for himself, but for others now.
Tonight you'll get to decide whether justice has been done or not. As we explained last night, in 1985, two Aboriginals, John Carpeney and Derek Bromley, were sentenced to 28 and 32 years jail for the drowning murder of 21-year-old Stephen DeCosa. Carpeney was paroled in 2004 after he agreed that the evidence put to the court was sufficient to convict him.
Yes. I mean, with the evidence that they had, they found me guilty.
And if you said no?
I'd be still sitting there.
Like Derek is?
Yes.
Derek Bromley, on the other hand, is now serving his 28th year. He could have been paroled 6 years ago, but he refuses to concede that he had anything to do with DeCosa's death.
He said, I don't care whether I rot in there, but I'm not going out there where people are pointing the finger at him saying he's a murderer.
His brother Russell and his wife Robin are convinced the trial was flawed and believe the only fair thing is for there to be a judicial review of the case. The Crown case relied largely on the evidence of Beau Carter, who claimed he and Carpeney, having taken a taxi to town, bumped into Bromley and Stephen DeCosa outside a city nightclub in the early hours of April 4th, 1984. The taxi then took the four to the end of Hindley Street, after which they headed for the Torrens, where a fight occurred.
Hey! Let go!
Beau Carter claimed he'd panicked and run off during the assault. 5 days later, when DeCosa's body was found in the river, Carter incriminated Bromley and Carpeney.
I believe he was very vulnerable to suggestion toward the prosecution's case.
So he calls the police and he puts you in it. How did you feel about that?
Knowing Beau, I wasn't surprised.
John Carpeney originally said he wasn't there, but last night on this program he admitted he had gone to the city with Carter. Bromley maintains he was not involved in any way. The other key eyewitness for the Crown was the taxi driver who drove the men around. But serious questions remain over his identification of Bromley, whom he says was immaculately dressed.
Sounds ridiculous.
Ridiculous, yes.
Impossible, according to Andrew Leschke, who gave Bromley a lift to town that night, but who was never called to give evidence.
You recall what he was wearing at the time?
He had jeans and a T-shirt or some kind of perhaps top, I think. Pretty straightforward, simple.
Just casual clothes?
Casual.
But there's much more that's troubling about the case. For a start, the prime witness, Beau Carter, was mentally disturbed at the time, diagnosed as a schizophrenic.
What sort of a person was Beau Carter?
Very, very hypo.
He'd spent time in Hillcrest Mental Hospital and admitted to hallucinating, seeing the devil and hearing strange voices. Leading up to that night, he confessed he was suffering a relapse.
Yeah, well, I never ever thought about his illness, I knew he was on medication and that, in and out of hospital or wherever it was.
You were facing a murder charge.
Oh, yeah.
You were facing 20, 30 years in jail. I mean, it was serious.
Oh, yeah.
And he was their prime witness.
I mean, I was disappointed.
According to his evidence, in the midst of the attack on Dakosa, he took off.
He says that he was freaked out and that he took off to the pie cart.
The pie cart.
Yes.
The pie cart, where he requested a cup of water. No mention of the drama he'd just left. He then says he met the other two on the bridge, even offering them a drink of his water.
There's a lot of fabrication going on there. It didn't actually occur in that way at all.
It was then, Carter said, the police had driven past. Yet the police said they'd only ever seen Bromley alone on the bridge. Carter claimed Carpeney had taken his bag, yet the patrol found Carter himself with it, even checking it for his ID.
Why do you think that the police didn't investigate Beau's role in this?
Well, I think now it was to help the police to put a couple of, well, at that time I was still in my frame of mind, a juvenile, off the streets. That's all I could think of.
Do you think that this was an easy conviction? They had a witness who was prepared to testify.
Oh, yeah.
They could put you away.
Whatever role Beau Carter played in the events of that night, we do know he checked into Hillcrest the following day and remained there for 3 months.
He had not been taking his medication at the time, and at that very time he was a report said that he was overtly psychotic.
So the police's chief witness was in a mental hospital.
That's right.
While the judge warned the jury about Carter's condition, no expert evidence was led by the defence, yet he had undergone a psychiatric assessment at Hillcrest.
An assessment does exist, yes.
And do we know what it says?
We know that it says that he was, at the time, the precise time, he was overtly psychotic, he was delusional, and also that he was posing as different entities.
On the other hand, John Carpeney all along had claimed he didn't meet Carter, didn't go to town, wasn't there at all.
But that wasn't true.
No.
So if that's not true, why should people believe you now?
Because now people are a lot smarter than today than they were back in that time.
He says back then, Aborigines like Bromley and he, already with criminal records, knew they'd never be believed, whatever they'd said.
I know they wouldn't. You always come up against the wall, and that was it. There was nowhere else to go. So I used to go into myself and turn off.
And that's how you survived, is it?
That's how I survived.
He now says Carter's version is only partly true, up until they reached the Torrens, where he says he and Bromley left to try and find an open pub.
I was, so, I was urging them, come on, let's go get a drink. But, so me and Derek went, and Beau was still there, and Dakosa.
So when you left, he was alive and well.
Dakosa was still standing, still on the bank with Beau.
Carpeney claims they were playing with the barbell and talking about the drugs in Carter's bag.
All I know is that Derek was with me when we left.
Is it possible that there was an accident, he fell in the water, Carter panicked? Is that possible?
Very big possibility.
And then he constructed a story that...
Well, I wouldn't be surprised.
Of course, Carter had plenty of incentive to blame the others. After all, he could otherwise be a suspect himself.
Well, it just seemed he was protecting himself. I mean, that was obvious.
But there's something more which meant the jury was misled on crucial evidence. That was the flawed autopsy of forensic pathologist Dr. Colin Manock, which had triggered the murder inquiry in the first place.
There are marks on the body. I'm not going to be specific in relation to those marks, but because of the condition of the body and the post-mortem examination, we've decided to declare this a major crime.
I think it's extremely worrying when firm medical opinions are expressed in a setting where we know there is enormous variability and unreliability of interpretation of forensic medical evidence. And that's particularly the case where you're dealing with a body that's decomposed.
At least 3 forensic pathologists have since examined Dr. Manock's evidence. All have said he arrived at conclusions that were virtually impossible. Associate Professor David Ranson is the Deputy Director of the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine.
Clearly there are areas there which could have been challenged very substantially.
Dr. Manock told the jury the injuries were inflicted during an assault, possibly minutes prior to death, despite the body bumping around in the Torrens for 5 or 6 days.
This is an extremely difficult area to give accurate opinion on, and I think we would be talking about a very wide range of possibilities rather than specific times.
Is it possible that those marks could have been made after death?
Well, all I can say is that some bruises can occur post-mortem.
And for him, the cause of death was beyond question.
There can be no doubt that the death resulted from drowning.
Now, I couldn't use that phrase in a decomposed body, full stop, in any case.
35 years later, the same Dr. Manock, on oath in another court, admitted the impossibility of his own conclusions.
Obviously, if a body is pulled from water after a week, then you're not going to see the signs of drowning.
This admission and the impact of his erroneous evidence on a jury looking for answers should be enough to have a review of the case.
He stated the time of death, the manner of death, the time and the manner of the injuries on the body as fact. When since then we learned that that was an impossible assertion to make.
But there's more. Bo Carter's story was backed up at the time by his sister Jenny, who had a volatile relationship with Carpeney.
But I still didn't worry about it because what they were saying wasn't true.
When she told the court Carpeney had confessed to her and had also incriminated Bromley in the murder, the die was cast.
The family had a very strong bond together.
So she was backing up her brother?
I mean, that was the only thing that I could think of.
Yet in what appears to be an attack of conscience some years later, Jenny Carter gave a very different account. In this statement, she tells how her brother Bo had come to her house that morning on drugs and wearing wet, blood-stained clothes. She went on to say that later in that week,
Johnny told me he was there and punched him a couple of times. He didn't say Derek Bromley was there. I don't know why I said Derek killed the man.
Jenny also admitted giving her evidence while on drugs, adding,
John said that Bo had hit the man at the river with the dumbbell. I'm willing to go back to court again if I have to.
Sadly, Jenny has since died, and the truth of that with her. As for the exact role of John Carpeney,